Good afternoon, everyone, and a hearty warm welcome to the session on how to tackle the DA-100 if you're not already a data analyst. I'm going to kick straight into a quick introduction to myself. So my name is Samuel Smith, and I work as a Power Platform consultant at the wonderful Cognizant Microsoft Business Group. I'm really into my certifications, as anyone who knows me on LinkedIn. I'm really sort of a passionate believer that as a framework for wherever you're at in your learning journey to learn the platform, they're a really, really wonderful thing. And I've been very fortunate in terms of my journey into the Power Platform and Dynamics 365 to benefit from a lot of the amazing material already in the community. And yeah, from my perspective, anything that I can give back to that or kind of pass that on in any way, shape, or form is very much why I'm here. In terms of the Power BI bug, so I sort of caught the bug in August of last year, and it was on a kind of like typical project where it was right. So we have a Power BI report that needs to be replicated in the new environment. Anyone fancy a go at it? No? Okay. I sort of put my hand up and downloaded and sort of started reverse engineering this said report. And then yeah, the deeper and deeper I got into it, the more and more I felt, well, hang about, this isn't it from a low code perspective, and you don't have to be a DAX wizard or a wizard with M language to create what are really meaningful, interesting reports for our end users. And I'm sure many people on this call have had the requirement from a client asking for something that's perhaps a little bit more visually appealing than the sort of standard model driven dashboards and reports and what that can bring. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think for those of us working in the Power Platform and working from more of a customer engagement Dynamics 365 perspective, it's Power BI can sometimes be seen as this bit of the Power Platform that sits towards the left with all of those BI developers, and not something that we really need to kind of sully our hands with. But I really think that it's really important to have the ability to create an appealing report in your tool set. And I think in terms of how the DA-100 is pitched, in terms of a difficulty level, I think it's a really, really good place to get started with. The learning pathways are fantastic, but I'll click into the agenda now and we can have a little chat a little bit about what we're going to be covering today, as long as with subtitle at the very, very beginning. Sorry, everyone. Can I just make sure that we're all on mute, if that's all right? Perfect. Thanks ever so much. So just crashing back to the agenda. So I sort of covered it a little bit there, what the sort of main thrust behind today is from my perspective. And that is, yes, as a data first professional, you really should learn Power BI and how it fits into the general Power Platform, and that it shouldn't just be something that sits onto the left that we let BI developers sort the reports out for us. I think it's really, really important to bring that into our general tool set. We'll do a little bit in terms of how to get started with Power BI, and then what I want to do is there's a little bit of an overview of the DA-100 skills measured document, but we're not just going to go through line by line and say, right, for prepare the data, you need to know this about Power Query. But what I want to do is cherry pick some elements which I think, coming from a Power Platform background, whether you're someone who's a bit of a whiz with Canvas apps or someone who's more of a Dataverse background, I want to touch on the things that will enable you as a kind of gateway into other elements of Power BI and sort of things that you can focus on. And then, I think I saw this in one of the questions that had been put forward to the Certification Saturday group, and that is the kind of how to acquire the skills and knowledge needed to pass the DA-100. And what we'll do is, I think it's obviously the learning path is, I think, the learning paths in Microsoft Learn are fantastic throughout, but I think as an introduction into Power BI, it's a really good set of examples and learning material. But if you're coming from a data first background, and for example, you're not a whiz with Power Query or with DAX or certain elements of report building, and also the governance structure within Power BI, then there are certain things that you are going to have to sharpen up on beyond the Microsoft Learn materials. So let's revisit our first topic, which is, again, why you, and I hope this isn't going to come across as too evangelical, but why you as a Dataverse professional should learn Power BI. And I think this really comes down to that, from a project perspective, sometimes the reporting, it's just one of these things that sort of gets left to the end, and then it's just a kind of like, right, we've innovated your process, we've got a new data model in place, and okay, so this is how you're going to view the data, right? Okay, great. And it can sometimes be seen as a little bit of an afterthought, but often I found in the projects that I've been involved in is that often the key decision makers in terms of whether the project is seen as a success, a lot of their portal into the outcomes of this project, whether it's a customer service center where you've implemented Dynamics 365 customer service and sales, for example, the output of the activity that you're allowing these people to produce, it's often at the end of the day seen by someone, either an executive level or a managerial level, that's looking at this output in they might not be a licensed Dynamics user, they might not be a licensed Dataverse user. So therefore, this reporting element at the very end really shouldn't be seen as an afterthought, because it is in essence what could be seen by some to be this is how we're going to measure whether this is a success. And the way that we shape how our customers see this data model that we've put so much work into, it then seems a little bit silly that we're not investing the time to make sure that it's presentable, it's understandable. And as you see in my third point there, for many this is, a lot of users throughout a large organization, they might have a situation where we've got maybe 20 Dynamics licenses, but pretty much everyone's got a Power BI Pro license, and it inevitably can become the key way to distribute data throughout all levels of the business. And so again, this is as a Dataverse professional, and just we put all of the time into building an application that is enabling our users to do what they need to do. But as I say, if the output of that is just meaningless and there's no sort of kind of data-driven story that we're taking people on, then we're missing a really vital link. And then, just looking at my second point there, it just looks better. I think it's a pretty fair point in terms of, I haven't come across many people that look at a model-driven dashboard or the charts that we get in a Canvas app and go, oh, that looks fantastic. This is something that we can spend time and get something that looks fantastic from a branding point of view, and something that people can interact with quickly, and it just looks better from my perspective. And especially now where we're able to have system embedded dashboards for Power BI, this is, I think for most customers looking at implementing a model driven app, having that as a way of looking at their data is going to be a lot more appealing. And then also, this can be a very quick and easy way to bring in data from external sources. I think especially if we're at a point where we're not expecting users to be performing proper CRUD operations on the data, but they just need to be able to see it in relation to the data that they have in Dataverse, then being able to do that in Power BI and with the new capabilities around composite models, And even if it's, and dare I say it, where you might have users that are still wedded to having a couple of processes in Excel, for example, even though we're trying to get them off Excel, but being able to bring that data in and relate it to data within Dataverse, within Power BI, it's a very, 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 very powerful tool. And yeah, we'll go through a little bit more in terms of how to get started with Power BI, and hopefully, as I think the DA-100 being a really, really good starting point, and using it as a framework to learn with Power BI. So let's click in, and this next slide is very, very appealing in terms of that we're straight into the Power Platform Admin Center. And from my perspective, the easiest way, there's many different ways that you can connect up to your Dataverse environment. But this for me, in terms of a quick, right, I want to get at my data quickly. I don't want to be thinking about what kind of connection that I'm going to be using. This is a really, really good way to get started. So first of all, if I was saying, if you've let's take it as a red or a prerequisite that you've downloaded Power BI Desktop. This is where you just need to go into your environment and make sure that you've got the following things sorted. So the TDS endpoint, make sure that's clicked on. For the future, when you want to start embedding Power BI visuals, once you've got this report nice and looking beautiful, then click that on as well. Then the next step, and this I picked this up from I think it might have been a Reza Durrani video, in terms of where I thought creating a direct query string and using a SQL Server connection and and making sure all the ports are working and thinking like, right, I've got everything sorted. There's a very, very easy way to get a direct query straight into your Dataverse environment of choice. So once we've got this all configured, then going into the Maker portal, this really, really is as simple as clicking on Tables, go to Data, and then just clicking Analyze Power BI. It's really as simple as that. And then that will launch a download of what's called a PBIDS file. You open up the PBIDS file within Power BI Desktop, and then you're going to be straight into, and you're going to then just have a complete list of all of your tables from within your environment, and then you're all connected up. You're all ready to go. And depending on, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of example data sets that you can play with in your learning journey, or if you are just connecting up to a data source and you're ready to have a go, then this is a really, really quick way at getting at your Dataverse environment. And there are other implications or things to consider in terms of what kind of connection method you want to use, whether in some instances it's better to be using an import or different things like that. But all those good things come to those who wait. But I just wanted to give you that little bit of a taster of how just to get started and get the data into your Power BI model. So next, what we're going to do is, as I said at the beginning, we were going to do a little bit of a cherry picking of the different elements of the DA-100 that I think, first of all, if you're coming from a Dataverse background, you're going to have an understanding of data modeling. You're already coming into this with a really, really good a good knowledge and understanding. And there are just some specific elements which I found getting started with kind of going, oh, hang on, that's that's going to take a little bit of extra knowledge and a little bit of extra fine tuning, especially in supplement to the learning path. So what I'm going to do is click into our overview of the DA-100 skills measured document. And again, do not worry, we're not just going to go in line by line, but what I wanted to do again was just discuss and cherry pick some elements that I think are really, really important, especially in terms of where, as per normal with most of these, the kind of the associate level exams, it's very, very, very difficult for the learning pathways, as fantastic as they are, to cover off this wide spectrum of, starting skills and where you're coming into this. And, in terms of getting to grips with Power Query, getting to grips with DAX, and if you've never written a line of DAX in your life, I can tell you that, most likely performing the examples in the learning pathways are probably not going to be enough. And again, the sort of the focus of what we're doing here is to take it as a prerequisite that you've already connected up to Power BI, you've already gone through all of the Microsoft Learn pathways, and then we're sort of getting into a little bit more of the sort of the meat and bones of the elements of this DA-100 that you need to be really, really aware of. So one of the elements of the exam that you're going to really have to have a good handle on are the types of connection and the limitations. So will you be using a direct query, or will you be using an import? And so from that perspective, if, for example, I had a question asking me about having direct access to a huge database, so for example, that was larger than a gigabyte, then I'd be then thinking about direct query, because there are limits to the size of the import file that you can have. But again, it's a case of being able to, and it's again, this is a long-standing thing with the Microsoft exams, where being able to translate the limitations of the platform and then applying that to what are hopefully good real life situations are very, very important. And you might come to, and I've come to this as well, where sometimes direct query is also not isn't a great option, because in essence, and this is going to depend on the type of data source that you're working with, but where direct query is essentially kind of hitting the server at quite a pace and quite often, whereas from an import file, you can obviously set your refresh and you set the times of day that you want that to be. You can then, especially if you're working against a production database, you can obviously take into account a little bit more of the sort of server performance that you might be having. So that's just something, again, there's all the different types of connection. Just again, it is covered in the learning pathways, of course, but just start thinking about the limitations, especially of the import, and then also where would you be using direct query and when would you be using it from an import perspective. Again, just I don't want to labor the point, but for example, another sort of real life scenario would be, as a sales representative, I need a real-time view of my opportunities within 5 seconds of making an action within Dynamics 365. If you're working against an import type of connection, which is refreshed 3 times a day, that obviously isn't going to fulfill that requirement, for example. Now, this is actually, and I honestly, with Power Query, I've really kind of warmed to this. Out of all of the different topics I've within the DA-100, this is the kind of thing where I was like, this is the coolest thing in the world in terms of the levels of transformation that you can achieve against your data set. All with, and as you see that I say there, you can start with exploring the GUI, and then you can start looking at how those functions are expressed. But it's a real kind of like little bit of a cheat book, really, because you've got this, you've loaded up, you've connected up to your data source, and preferably you'll, in your dialog box, where you've either got the option just to load the entire model, or I would say with best practice, you're going to go in and you're going to pick the columns that you need. The kinds of things that you can do in the GUI, and then what you can do is, after you've performed all these actions, whether it's joining tables, whether it's the column by example, or even if you just want to, I don't know, replace null values with a specific value that's meaningful to your situation, it's all just a pace of clicking around and saying, right, do this, do that. But in terms of the DA-100, it's not going to really test you on how to use the GUI. And there are definite questions where you're going to have, a set of drop-down boxes where you're going to have to know the correct expression to perform, whichever task they're asking you to perform with that code. And so it is. I think it can look very sort of disconcerting when you open up the advanced query editor to begin with, and you're kind of like, if you've never worked with it before, kind of going, what on earth is all this? I've had to learn DAX, and now I've got to learn this as well. But I have to say, from my perspective, and I probably didn't make this very, very clear at the beginning, but I don't come from a technical coding background whatsoever. In fact, I used to be an opera singer, so this is all, I'm coming at all of this from a low code perspective first. The Power Query stuff, once you open up the advanced editor, and you say you've already performed actions like merging columns, which you can do literally just by clicking new column by example, and then you just copy and paste the values from whichever columns you want to join. And then you kind of go, okay, that's awesome. I've now performed this join, whether it's, I don't know, a special index or whatever you want to perform by joining those two columns, merging those two columns together. Then after you've done that bit of magic wizardry with the GUI, I would strongly advise you to then click on the advanced query window within Power Query, and you can see the line of code that's been written against it. And you see the step that's been created, and you're kind of like, okay, text combine, and it's done that. Okay. And then as you go forward, and you can still, and this is what I mean about that, to get started with Power BI and start doing these really, really powerful functions, you don't need to understand M code. You just don't. However, you will get to a point where the more and more transformation that you perform, the more and more easier it is just to open up the advanced query editor and just go, right, I need to perform X, Y, and Z. But from a perspective of learning the syntax and understanding this does this, and then I get this, just looking into the query editor, it's an absolute lifesaver, honestly. So I would strongly advise that you guys get into that, even if it's working retrospectively. So say if it's a report that you created and you've used the GUI to create pretty much 90% of it, go into that query editor and have a look at how it's performing each action and how it works. The next example, and again from my perspective, I've started to look into learning SQL properly and doing a nice Transact SQL course. But the first time I heard about joining tables or merging of queries was in Power Query. But again, this was an element that's coming from a Power Platform background, and not necessarily having done a lot of work of interacting directly with the SQL server and writing SQL queries in the Management Studio. I had to really sort of like think, right, okay, so what does a left join do? What does an inner join do? What does an outer join do? All of these kind of things. So if you're not coming from a sort of SQL background, and that kind of joining of tables and all that sort of stuff, then there are elements of this exam where you have to understand what kind of join you would use to perform, so I don't know, if you needed to perform an inner join, if you're not comfortable with those that kind of terminology, then there's definitely some work for you to do there. And I would strongly suggest to you, there's some great Transact SQL courses that I found helped me a lot with that. It's not that you need to be able to write these joins, but having an understanding of how those joins work will be really, really important. So I would strongly suggest that. Another area here that I mean, I've got to be honest. So from the sort of the column profiling, distribution, and the sort of quality aspect of it, I probably don't use this function as much as I should do on a day-to-day basis. But it's very much present in the exam. And I think in an ideal world where if we're working sort of from the timeline of how you're creating the report, then when you've loaded the data into Power Query and you're having a look at it, then obviously the next steps and what you do with that data to fulfill your outcome, you need to obviously have an idea of what, the kind of being able to look at the column profiling, the distribution, and the column quality. That's definitely something to get into. And as I say, it's one of those things that isn't, you sort of see a little bit about it in the learning pathway, but it's not necessarily something which you would think, okay, so that's going to make up a big part of the exam. So just again, I would probably do yourself a favor and have a look on Microsoft Docs purely around column profiling, distribution, and quality. And don't don't take it from bad Sam about not using this feature. I probably should use it a lot more than I do. But so that's, yeah, definitely have a look into that. The other aspect of this is when we're still at this point of loading the data and preparing the data, is thinking about how you could use parameters. And parameters are amazing things, and you can house all sorts of if this then this aspect to it. And I pretty much purely use it as a way of housing the server name and the database name for, if I'm working from we're going through the life cycle of a dev test prod situation. But again, parameters in terms of how you assign certain values at this point, again, something very, very important for you to have a look at. Then when we're talking about connecting to data sources, I mean, this is obviously, it's a pretty wide ranging subject to get stuck into. But there are specifics around, how you would connect up to a SharePoint library, and thinking about the URL that you would use, or which bit of the URL you wouldn't use. So again, for me, that was a little bit of a shock with this exam. So I think learning about how you would connect to every single type of data source, I mean, obviously, it's most of the time is going to be down to what kind of project work you're doing or what kind of data source you actually have access to. But there are loads of great free web APIs that you can connect up to. There's loads of different examples. And again, hopefully I've framed a lot of this conversation around you as a Dataverse professional being able to stuck in to your environment and get connected that way. But when you go into the get data dialog within Power BI and you just look at all of these connections that you can just use straight out of the box, it's pretty incredible. So spend a bit of time going through that beyond the examples that you would have had within the learning pathways. But yeah, before we bring to a close the sort of prepare data section of the DA-100, this is, and I've called this, I mean, it sounds like a little bit preachy, doesn't it? Remember the hierarchy of transformation. But there are examples in this exam where you will have, there's several different ways that you can skin a cat. Yeah. So you can, I've seen plenty of reports where someone has just kind of just dumped all the data straight into the model, and then they've written measure upon measure in DAX, and then the report doesn't perform very well. But it's this hierarchy of transformation is very, very important, and knowing what the sort of how to make your report perform as well as possible. And really, in an ideal world, you'd be performing as much of the transformation at the source. So from a Dataverse perspective, it's not one of these things where you're going to be able to get at the views that you've created, sadly, from that perspective. But what I would urge you to do is that instead of, and if you're getting into this kind of thing, especially at the beginning of your journey, this is actually the ideal time to be thinking about this, because if you've already gone down the DAX rabbit hole, which it has its place and it's definitely a skill to learn, but when you're thinking is, and the engine that it actually performs all those calculations within the model, there's a lot of the time when you go into a Power BI report that's mostly been modeled in DAX, you are, even if it's very performant DAX, and there's different types of DAX that you can write that are going to be the sort of the most performant. And again, it's a real rabbit hole and it's an incredible skill, and I'm in envy of those people. But when I'm working with Dataverse data sources, I try and do as much as I can in Power Query. So, and there are some, and when I said also the first thing is to do it at the source. So, if you can create and do the joins that you need to do, if you're working in SQL, for example, or if you create a more meaningful collection in Cosmos DB, for example, then do it at the source. But even from a sort of a SQL query perspective, a lot of the time Power Query will be able to write more performance SQL than you can. And it's an interesting topic, and it's probably beyond the purview of today. But this is why I've kind of spent so much time on the prepare the data section, is that if you take the right step here and do as much of your performance, what you're doing in Power Query, then your report will be rapid. And I've done this exercise where I've done pretty much everything I possibly can do in Power Query in one report, and then done the same report in DAX, and the difference is startling. And yes, you probably will need to think about how does that impact your refresh times, and as I said, there's always more than one way to skin a cat. But if I haul the conversation back to the DA-100 exam, it is that Microsoft are promoting that you're going to do as much of your transformation in Power Query first of all, or if we're really in sort of practical sense, if you can do it at the source, and then when you're connecting to that source, the data transformation, or as much of it has taken place already, then even better for the performance. But the kinds of transformation that you can do in Power Query in a performance way, that once it's then refreshed and it's in your report, it will be rapid and it will be fantastic. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a 1, 2, 3 there, the remember the hierarchy of transformation. So that is the prepare the data section. As I said, when you're coming from a Dataverse background, the Power Query, the M code, and I would really strongly suggest just get started with the GUI, have a play around with it, and then as you're playing around with it more and more, then see what's going on in the background, or what I used to say in Opera, see what's happening behind the curtain. Yeah, and that is all happening in that wonderful advanced query editor. Cool. So that is the first sort of major topic to cover in the skills measured. We're going to now crash on to the exciting part, the model the data. And again, I think as a Dataverse professional, you're going to have a really good head start here. Because you would have already, in all likelihood, you've already had the thing of kind of thinking, okay, so I'm creating I don't know, for example, a lookup from one table to another. You're going to understand the kind of relationships that are open to you. And what you'll find, and in the example that I gave at the beginning, in terms of how you could connect up to your Dataverse, what will happen from when you're in a direct query sort of mode is that a lot of the time it will honor all of the relationships that you already have in that database. And when you do a direct import as well, a lot of the time Power BI in the background will kind of go off and kind of go like, okay, I think that's a relationship, that's a relationship. Da, 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 da. But when you sort of get into the sort of nitty gritty of modeling the data and getting it to a point where you can filter and you can slice it how you want to, the relationship modeling aspect of this, again, I think it's probably not something that you're going to have to really step onto too much to have a good idea of this in the exam. I personally found the questions on relationships, it was kind of as simple as kind of looking at, okay, so we've got an account to contact relationship, there's many contacts to one account. And then you can, it's that kind of level of relationship question. So I think you're going to be in a good space. The star schema aspect of this, so you'll just to finish off that bullet point above. So in terms of the cardinality and looking at the cross filter direction, so what you'll find is you've already, so say if you're already setting up a relationship that isn't there for some reason between the contact and the account, and you've used the account ID columns and you've drawn them up together, you can choose how the filtering action can behave. And this again is something where if you don't fully understand the implications of what you're doing, and how the filtering can work from one relationship to another, then I would strongly suggest that you keep it pretty simple at the beginning, and that's the whole point of the star schema again. And where you've got your fact table, so you've got, you know, in the whole, as you can imagine, a star schema, you've got your fact table in the middle, whether it's sales or whatever, and then you've got your dimensions that come off of that. And sometimes I found in modeling data within Dataverse, it's pretty difficult sometimes to do that, especially when you've got to go through several entities to find what you need to find. So it's not always an easy one to attain, but know that that's what you're heading for in terms of the star schema. The next one, in terms of model the data, and you know, casting my mind back to when I took this exam, I'm not going to talk about specific questions, but the creating of a common date table is an important one to have a think about, because again, there are the auto time date functions in Power BI are amazing, and it's great, especially when you start, just to be able to whack a date filter on there, and then off you go. But as you sort of progress with your transformation with your modeling and your abilities within Power BI, you will start needing to think about how you're going to create your own bespoke date table. And there's several reasons why you might want to do this. One of them is that having a contiguous or continuous, I'm sure someone in the chat can correct me on which is correct, but having a continuous date range that you can filter against, for example, sales, is going to be incredibly important. And then being able to connect that date table to different tables within your report, it's a very important thing to be able to do. And there's loads of really good examples of how you build your date table. And again, you can either do it in DAX or in Power Query. I've got one that I use in Power Query and probably what will happen is you'll come across one that you really like, and you're able to set up, you know, fiscal year, fiscal month, and fiscal quarters, and all of that sort of good stuff, and you'll just, you know, use that one. But again, that's just looking beyond what's available to you from the Learn materials. The date table is definitely something which I've spun my wheels on quite a lot to come to something that works for me. And I would say for you, depending on how much experience and how much kind of practical usage you're getting out of Power BI, getting your head around, even whichever method you decide to use, having that ready to go in your toolbox, and having whether it's the DAX that's written or just having your PBIX file of your date table ready to go, I would strongly suggest. Then, yes, we're going to get into the DAX scenario. And yes, it is Excel-like. And if you're coming from an Excel background, I think you're going to be in a good spot. As I said, personally, from my perspective, a lot of this has been new. Believe it or not, in Opera, I didn't use Excel very much, so it's all been new to learn to me. But from what I understand, there's you're going to have a good leg up. But it really does have its own idiosyncrasies, and there's some. I will talk about some of the different materials in the community that you can look at. Like DAX Guide and DAX.do, and basically SQL BI, which is a fantastic YouTube channel. I always, whenever there's a new video and it comes out, I'm on my phone watching it. But there are the DAX rabbit hole is a real thing, and there are some people who can do incredible things with it. For this exam, do you need to be an absolute DAX wizard? I really don't think you do. These are, and we'll talk a little bit about the DAX guide towards the end of the session, but these are the main functions that you need to have a good handle on. And a little bit how I was talking about with Power Query early on, where in the exam you are going to be asked how to perform a certain calculation, and you're going to be given some different possibilities within which to use. So again, beyond the Microsoft Learn stuff, I would go into the DAX guide. Again, I've got a link to that at the end of the session. Go into the DAX guide, and there's some really, really good methods of how to learn this stuff, and how filter works and top end. And so, again, going back to our sort of sales example, knowing using top end to be able to rank, go, I want my top 10 sales performers this year. The difference between count and distinct count and sum X, again, we don't really have time to sort of go into that kind of granularity here, but from my perspective, these are the definite areas that you need to have a good handle on and understand when and when not to use them. But beyond that, again, DAX, I think, is an area where you could probably spend your entire day, your entire life in. But again, for the purposes of the DA-100, those are the areas that I would look at. So let's take the data bit as read. We're now going to get into the part where we've got the data into our model, we've got it all modeled, we're happy with how it's all going to look. How are we actually going to present this back? And we're going to be talking about how you're going to visualize the data. And again, a lot of my knowledge and sort of experience with Power BI has just with projects and having to, someone's asked for X, Y, and Z, and I've had to go off and find out how to do it. But for this exam, depending, how often you're using Power BI, and especially if you're doing it just with your own data sets and you're kind of having to, learn it with your own imagination almost, then one of the really good things that you can do is just when you're in Power BI and as I said, you've got all your data sorted in your model, is I would honestly just drag every single visual onto your canvas. There's not that many actually, and it won't take you long. But with your example data set, just pull them all into your canvas and look at the fields that you need to put in and start working out how it fits together. And that will just give you a really quick, easy sort of like, right, this is when I would use a line graph. So, I mean, for example, when you will be asked how to choose appropriate visuals for certain scenarios, which I think is fair enough. And just, exploring those different ones and kind of going, oh, okay, so, so I've got, I don't know, different categories of a product that I need to show their performance over a period of time. Okay, a stacked area chart or all of these different things. The more that you can, and you probably noticed this throughout the session, is that I'm all about, if you can find a real life scenario that you're using and pin that to a technical concept, great. So start taking on those things. The R and Python visuals. Now, as I said, I am not a data scientist by any stretch of the imagination, and the stuff that people do with R and Python visuals is pretty beyond me. But again, in the exam, you will be asked things around like how many rows basically that you can pass to these kind of visuals. So just definitely think about, what are the limitations. So for example, like an R visual, it can only receive up to 150,000 rows. So if you've got a massive data set that's got more than that going on, obviously you're going to have to think about that. We've also got a little, and I think, in a lot of exams, these are always the kind of the Microsoft's happy place, I think, in terms of giving you, a set of different tasks, and then you have to order those tasks to produce a certain outcome. And so things like having an idea of like how you would create a mobile dashboard, how you're going to set up the Q&A feature, how you're going to set a theme, all of this kind of stuff. Just what I find is really good is just to go into Microsoft Docs and just work your way through the list and kind of really ingrain that in your head. Because to be honest, even when you're doing it on a day-to-day basis, and I would imagine for quite a lot of you potentially looking at this exam, you're not necessarily using Power BI daily. So even when it's in your muscle memory, to be honest, knowing, oh, okay, so now I've performed that, now I need to do that. It's not always one of those things that comes naturally. So I would definitely go and visit those topics in Microsoft Docs and get an idea of that. Then it's kind of sort of like a little bit of housekeeping around how you would set up a drill through, how you use tooltips. So for example, when you're I don't know, if you've got a pie chart full of different products, and setting up with your end users, like, okay, so you're hovering over I don't know, the green car section. What about the green car? Do you want to have it? We've got all this other information about the green cars. What else do you want to bring into that tooltip? So it's this kind of stuff, and it is exciting because it allows you to start thinking about how you're going to make your report as accessible and as usable, to your end users. The other aspect of this is just how you're going to set up your visual level filters. As I say, in an ideal world, you would have done as much of your transformation as possible before this, but when you're working out all of the different things you can do in terms of syncing slicers across different report pages and all this sort of stuff, have a play around with it. That's all I can say. Is have a little play around with it, and it'll all become clear. And finally, on the visualized data, we think of I think for a lot of this stuff, I would suggest that you think about the order of events in which that you create certain things, and really think about what you need to do in a certain order, because in the exam situation, you will thank yourself for that. So in terms of analyzing the data, again, these are certain aspects where you're going to have just a handle. There's a lot of these, to be honest, that I hadn't used before preparing for this exam. So, for example, the key influencers visual, the percentile lines, all of this kind of stuff, where it's, unless you've got the individual requirement, you're probably not going to be thinking about it too much. So, again, like I said earlier, once you've dragged all these different visuals into your canvas, start having a play around with them, and then working your way through, whether it's through this document or through the skills measured document, being like, right, have I been able to produce something that makes sense with this? And again, one that is a very, very powerful thing at the bottom there, the conditional field formatting. Again, having an idea of how you would set that up, and how you would create rules, so even whether it's as simple as, if there's 70 green cars in this column, then it has a background of green, but if it has 80, then it has a darker shade of green, whatever. Having a play around with that again will be very, very useful to you. Then, and this is probably an area when we're talking about the deploy and maintain deliverables section. So obviously, when we're coming from a Dataverse background and sort of the governance and security that we can apply to our data, then as Dataverse people, this is something that we understand pretty well. But the sort of how you would set up role level security and how you would implement it, that's again, for securing a Power BI report, is often a very, very different exercise than you would be with Dataverse. And again, when you're thinking about bringing in a composite data model as well, and bringing in data from different data sources that don't have a sort of a hierarchical security model, thinking about how you're going to implement it and where you need to set it up. So for example, at the actual data set level, and if you're going to be achieving this with security groups and all of this sort of stuff, you definitely need to have a good play around with this. And again, it's difficult if you're not delivering reports on a project basis, because when you're in your own environment and you're having a play around, it's the last thing you're probably going to think about. For example, is I need to apply a sensitivity label to my AdventureWorks data set. But it's an area where you definitely need to have an idea. And then the final point here that I wanted to go for is talking around the sort of apps versus reports, and what are the sort of the main differences. and again, it's obviously it's a pretty obvious thing to think about how you're going to get this report to people or this application, and what kind of access rights do they need to the workspace that houses the Power BI report or the app. And this kind of governance stuff, again, it's the concepts will be familiar to you, but sometimes I think when the concepts are kind of similar, but there are some really big differences, you can sometimes go down the sort of wrong path because you've got something in your mind from Dataverse. So again, I'd really start thinking just go back over not just the Microsoft Learn portion that talks about the like role level security and the roles within workspaces, but go into the docs and really get a good handle on. So basically, the main reason I'm saying this is that if you've been asked to distribute a report to a company of 150 people, and some of those people need to be able to do X, Y, and Z with the report, and the others only need to do C with the report, you are going to have to know what roles within the workspace that you're going to give to them, or whether you're just going to share the app with them, or how these things are going to work. So that was our rather long but hopefully useful sort of cherry pick of the skills measured section of the DA-100. I want to spend a little bit of time now just talking about, obviously I've talked about the different skills that you need to get a good handle on to sort of think, right, I'm going to book myself in for the DA-100. But I want to just spend a little bit of brief time going over the different areas that you can go to acquire the skills and knowledge that you're going to need to pass the DA-100. And as I've said several times throughout this session, I really do think that the learning paths for the 100 exams, so this one and also the PL100, they're really, really good because it's pitched at a level where it's not so easy where you're thinking like, goodness me, this is, I'm being taught to suck eggs here, but it's giving you a kind of taste of what the technology can do, and then kind of like going, right, so this is like your gateway and this is, the next step. So once you've created, you've completed that learning path, or ideally whilst you're doing the learning path, I would strongly suggest that you connect up to your Dataverse sample data, because it's a sample data set that's ready there for you to get going on, and just get building and start setting yourself some real life examples, or think about some of the reporting requirements that you've had in projects, or what you would like to see as an end user, and then trying to start building it, and preferably think about a lot of what's in the skills measured as a way to kind of guide yourself into that. And again, just getting a handle on it wasn't a particularly an element of the exam that I remember in great depth, but embedding your Power BI reports into Dataverse dashboards, I think honestly, your end users will thank you for it, especially now where you can house your Power BI dashboard in a proper solution, and there's a little bit more governance in terms of how you can do that. So yeah, definitely explore that and have fun with it. In terms of those next sort of steps after doing the learning path, I've included a link there to the dashboard in a day. So if you click into that, there's another couple of different data sets. So if you're getting bored of the example data set that comes with Dataverse, then there's a really, really good one in there as well. And then also just get yourself over to the GitHub repository for the DA-100 as well, because sometimes I think when you're to go back through all of the learning path and be like, right, that was this lab, that was that lab. There's a lot of really good things where you can access the solution files and sort of like how best to, or quote unquote best to fulfill a certain requirement. So that I found was a really, really helpful, and it's also related to the DA-100. So it's not just a kind of like, right, so you've done the DA-100 and now here's something completely random and not related, but you're trying to fulfill the same action, if that makes sense. The next two, which are actually both put together by SQL BI, so they're both free. The DAX guide is it goes into incredible depth, but I would strongly advise you to go back and look at the functions that I talked about that you need to have a handle on, and have a look at the DAX guide, and it will break it down to you in a little bit more of a specific way. The DAX.do by SQL BI. So this is a really cool tool where they basically, I think they've created their own sort of version of the AdventureWorks data set. And then they've kind of put like a front end on that you can just access. You just click into that link there, and then you can just write DAX against it and execute it. So again, like, if you haven't got to that point where you've got your sample data set up and going, or if you want to be able to compare against those solution files, it's a really, really good start. The next step as well, and it's not something where I'm trying to plug Pluralsight, but again, just as the Power BI for Analysts course there, I had sort of, I haven't done the course, I've done sort of different elements of it. And again, just learning that next step beyond the Microsoft Learn pathways, I found incredibly helpful. So that's another really, really good resource. So just before we round off, another one of the practice, or sort of one of the questions that I saw in the document before starting was just around kind of like, right, so I've done the learning pathways, I've booked in for my exam. How do I know if I'm in the right ballpark? Yeah, or which bits that I need to get sorted on? So these are, the two, I'm going to confess to you that I haven't sat either of them, but looking through the examples for the measure up one as well, I would strongly suggest taking, depending where you are in your cycle, is take that in the mode which shows you the answers, or I think it's the study mode, as you go through, and that will be a really, really good quick way for you to kind of get a gauge of how to, which areas you need to sharpen up on before you get cracking. But as I said, I mean, from my perspective, if you're in the privileged position of being able to work with Power BI in your current projects, or if you've got a way to kind of crowbar in some reports, then that's going to be the best way. And I found that was, for me, by far the best way to learn. And as I say, how to figure out the best way to meet a real requirement. And if not, then use your imagination for the scenarios that you've had to solve, even if you're not in consultancy, or if you're not actually working in a tech organization at the moment, but using your imagination in terms of like, right, if as an end user, what would I want to see, or what do I need from this data set, and using that as a starting point, to get yourself in a good position for the DA-100. But I was hoping to launch into a Q&A, but I think I've already kind of we're up to 59 minutes in. So what I'll do is just sort of suggest, so when we, well, first of all, if you could complete the feedback submission form as well, let me know how you found the session. But also in the slide deck at the very beginning, I shared my LinkedIn profile, and please, connect, add questions. If you've got any questions on the session, please do reach out. I love talking about all things exams. So please do get in touch. But otherwise, I will hand you back over and wish you all the best with the rest of your certification Saturday.